She saved his life in the war, in a hail of bullets as people died around him. He was a white pilot. She was a dark-skinned female medic who was not taken seriously by many. After the evacuation, he disappeared. The letter he wrote never made it. 50 years passed. They didn't see each other, didn't write to each other, didn't know if the other was alive. And suddenly, in the nursing home where she'd been living for the last few years, he showed up, just walked in, looked into her eyes, and he recognized her. That meeting turned them both upside down. Everything that had been said and unspoken for half a century resurfaced in the silence, and it became clear this love story was not over. It was just waiting for its time. Subscribe to the channel. We tell real powerful and almost forgotten stories that keep your heart from getting stale. Write in the comments, do you believe love can survive 50 years of silence? Click the bell so you don't miss new videos. The day began like most others, wrapped in quiet routine and low morning light that filtered lazily through the blinds of room 216 at Oak Hill Veterans Residence. The carpet was a dull beige, the kind that seemed chosen to never reveal dust or wear, and the air held a faint scent of disinfectant and peppermint liniment. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was coughing. A radio played faint jazz in a room not far off. Ella Fitzgerald, maybe. Familiar. Comforting. Mabel Johnson, 82 years old, stood before her modest dresser, her reflection half lit by the soft glow of a single bedside lamp. She moved slowly, but with purpose, her fingers careful and deliberate as they smoothed out the wrinkles in her beige cardigan. Her hands, veined and calloused, shook just a little, not from weakness, but from age. And yet they still held a steady grace, like a pianist remembering an old melody. She picked up a small velvet box, one she kept tucked beneath folded pajamas. Opening it revealed the one thing she allowed herself to carry from her old life, the combat medical badge. The metal was worn but polished, the silver glint dulled only slightly by time. She pinned it just above her heart, where it always belonged. She didn't wear it for attention. No one here asked about her medals. Most of the staff barely remembered she had served. They saw a quiet black woman, kind but reserved, who took her tea without sugar and rarely spoke unless spoken to. But she wore the badge because it reminded her that her hands had once stopped blood from flowing, that her back had once carried the weight of another human being under enemy fire, that she had mattered once. Mabel adjusted the pin, straightened her shoulders, gave herself a nod in the mirror. Every Sunday, she walked through the halls at sunrise. Not for church, she had settled her account with the Lord a long time ago, but for her own kind of worship. She called it remembrance. Each step was a prayer for someone she had once known, someone she had saved, someone she hadn't. The corridor greeted her with silence. A nurse walked by pushing a cart, nodded politely. "Mornin', Miss Johnson." "Mornin'," Mabel replied. She spoke softly, but her voice still held the edge of command. A holdover from years barking orders in field hospitals. Her gait was slow, deliberate, but she didn't need a walker yet. Pride wouldn't allow it. Not while she could still stand. She passed the bulletin board, covered in construction paper pumpkins and faded photos of Family Day. She passed the television room where a few residents sat slouched in recliners, staring blankly at the Weather Channel. Outside, through the sliding glass doors, the courtyard was bathed in a soft amber glow. A single wooden bench sat beneath a sprawling sycamore tree, leaves beginning to turn with the promise of autumn. That was her place. She made her way there with patient steps, pausing only once to catch her breath near the koi pond. When she reached the bench, she exhaled slowly, lowered herself onto the wood, and settled in. Her back straight, her eyes alert. The garden was quiet this early, save for the wind rustling the leaves and a squirrel scratching at the mulch. She pulled from her sweater pocket a photograph, folded many times over. She opened it carefully, as one might handle a relic. The photo showed her unit. Kandahar, 2004. 10 soldiers lined up in the dust, sweat-streaked, sunburned, grinning with fatigue. Only one woman among them, only one black face. Mabel stood in the back, arms crossed, helmet slightly tilted. Her uniform was stained with sand and something darker. Her expression was unreadable. Her eyes moved to the man beside her, tall, lean, white, with pale green eyes and a crooked smile. His helmet was pushed back, and unlike the others, he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her. James T. Hartman. She traced his image with her thumb. There had been no goodbye. No, just a letter that never arrived. Mabel tucked the photo back into her pocket and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. The garden was her sanctuary. Here, time didn't chase her. Here, she wasn't 82. She was 24 again, running through sand and gunfire, her heart pounding not from exertion but from the sheer will to keep someone alive. She remembered dragging him from the wreckage of a smoking Chinook, his leg torn open, blood gushing, her own hands trembling as she pressed bandages into his side, her voice steady even when her mind screamed. He had smiled at her through cracked lips. "Didn't know angels wore boots," he had muttered before passing out. The next time he woke, he was in a tent, IVs in his arms, ribs wrapped tight. She was sitting beside him, chart in hand, sweat streaking her temples. They had talked, laughed once or twice. He had written something for her. A letter, he said, but she never saw it. And soon after, he was gone. Now, half a century later, she still remembered the exact color of his eyes. Still wondered what the letter said. Still wondered why it never reached her. The sound of footsteps pulled her back. Someone approaching, light and quick. She opened her eyes. "Miss Johnson?" It was Carla, the nurse's aide. Early 20s, all energy and wide eyes. She looked apologetic for interrupting. "Yes, child. There's, Carla hesitated, glancing down at her clipboard. "There's a visitor asking for you. A man says he might have served with you." Mabel blinked. Her throat went dry. "What's his name?" "James," Carla said. "James Hartman." Time stopped. The bench beneath her felt suddenly very far away. The warmth of the garden, the hum of the morning, all faded into a low ringing in her ears. It was impossible. It had to be a mistake. James was a common name. Hartman, too. It couldn't be him. Not here. Not now. But a voice inside her whispered, clear and insistent. "What if it is?" She rose slowly. Tell him I'll be there shortly." Back in her room, she stood once more before the mirror. Her reflection hadn't changed, but everything inside her had. Her hands trembled as she removed the medal from her chest and placed it carefully in the drawer. For once, she didn't want to meet the past as a soldier. She wanted to meet it as a woman. She brushed invisible lint from her cardigan, straightened her collar, and took a long breath. Then she stepped into the hallway. Not fast, not dramatic, but with every step, something long dormant stirred inside her. 50 years of silence were about to end. And somewhere, in the quiet sunlit lounge of a place where people came to wait out their last chapters, the next chapter of her story was just beginning. Kandahar didn't have a sound. It had a pulse, a low, vibrating thrum that lived beneath the heat and the dust, beneath the cracked concrete and constant growl of trucks, beneath the endless whirl of helicopters overhead. Mabel Johnson had been there long enough to hear that rhythm in her sleep. Sometimes, even now, she could feel it in her bones. It was 2004, early April, the dry season. The days were merciless and the nights worse. There was no such thing as silence, only the illusion of it. Quiet broken by sudden mortar fire, coughing soldiers, the distant clatter of gunfire that felt like thunder filtered through memory. The 315th Combat Support Hospital sat on the edge of the main forward operating base like a stitched-on afterthought. Canvas walls, rattling fans, rows of cots lined with the broken, the burned, and the barely breathing. Mabel, 34 and 5 years into her military service, had already stopped counting how many lives she'd patched back together. Or failed to. She moved like someone who had no time to waste, because she didn't. Shouts and groans filled the medical tent as another wave of casualties rolled in. 2 Humvees had been hit by an IED outside a small village, and the medics were already soaked in sweat before the first stretcher arrived. But that wasn't the day she met him. The day she met Lieutenant James T. Hartman began much quieter. It was just past midday. The heat had broken down one of the supply generators, and the mess hall had gone dark. Mabel was on break, sipping hot water masquerading as coffee from a metal mug when the radio crackled. "Medevac incoming," came the voice, flat and fast. "Downed bird. 1 confirmed wounded. Status critical. Request urgent triage." She didn't hesitate. By the time the Black Hawk touched down, she was already standing by the canvas gate, surgical gloves halfway up her forearms, heart steady. It was just another rescue, just another body to keep from dying. But when they rolled him in, bloody, unconscious, hanging on by threads, something flickered in her. Not recognition, not attraction, something simpler, sharper, a knowing. White male, early 30s, pilot's uniform soaked in blood and hydraulic fluid, shrapnel embedded along his ribcage, leg mangled, pulse rapid but erratic. "Vitals?" she barked as the stretcher team moved him to Bay 3. "Unstable, BP fallen." "We're not losing him," she snapped. "Clamp the bleeder. Intubate now. Start O-neg. Move." The team fell in around her, a blur of movement, tubing, blood, instruments. For the next 45 minutes, the world narrowed into that cot. The pilot's body arched once, a spasm, then sagged. Mabel pressed deep into his chest with her palms. "Come on," she whispered. "Don't you dare die on me." He didn't. Later that evening, long after the lights dimmed and the dust settled, she checked on him again. The triage tent had fallen into a kind of uneasy silence, one born of a temporary victory. The wounded were sleeping, or sedated. He lay on his cot, pale under the fluorescent glow, chest bandaged, IV dripping slowly into his arm. She scanned his chart. Hartman, James T., 82nd Airborne. She'd seen the name 100 times on intake logs. Now it had a face. She was about to move on when he stirred, eyes fluttered open, bleary, unfocused, pale green. "Am I dead?" he murmured. Mabel looked down. "Not on my table, you're not." His lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "Damn shame." She raised an eyebrow. "You flirting with your medic while half sedated? You must not be that bad off." He gave a raspy laugh. "You don't look like any angel I expected." "Good," she said. "Angels don't carry trauma shears." He closed his eyes, still smiling. In the days that followed, he healed slowly. The leg had been badly damaged, but not beyond saving. Mabel checked in on him twice a day, not because she had to, but because something about him pulled her back. He talked more once the pain lessened, about his childhood in Texas, about his favorite dog, a mutt named Whiskey, about flying. He asked questions, too, about her family, her hometown, her reasons for joining the army. "Birmingham," she said once. "The South teaches you to keep your head down, unless you know how to hold it high." He had nodded. "That explains the fire in your eyes." They began to talk after lights out, when the rest of the tent fell quiet and only the low beeping of machines marked time. She sat beside his cot, sometimes doing paperwork, sometimes just sitting. One night, during a sandstorm that rattled the walls, she admitted something she hadn't told anyone. "I didn't come here to be a hero," she said, voice low. "I came to get away. From smallness, from rules, from being told who I could be." "You became a damn hero anyway," he said, not looking at her. She didn't reply. By the third week, he was strong enough to write again. He borrowed paper from one of the orderlies and sat up painfully in bed, scribbling for a full hour. The next morning, he handed her the envelope. "For you," he said, "in case I forget to say it later." She took it, smiled faintly, tucked it into her pack. That evening, she reached for it to read, and it was gone. She never found it. Either it had slipped out during a shift or someone had picked it up, or maybe she'd imagined it entirely. She told herself it didn't matter, but it did. When the order came to transfer him back to a base in Germany, he tried to hide his disappointment. She didn't try to hide hers. They shook hands at the med tent gate. She squeezed once, firm. He held on a second longer. "I'll find you again," he said. "You won't recognize me," she replied. He grinned. "I'll be the old man with the limp. You'll be the one walking straight." Then he was gone, and she was left behind in the heat and the dust and the silence, under bullets and stars. The war didn't end when Mabel Johnson came home. The sand no longer clung to her boots, and the roar of helicopters didn't drown out her thoughts, but the echoes followed her. They nested in her bones, her breath, her sleep. When her tour ended and the plane touched down on American soil, she felt no triumph, just silence. Just an overwhelming emptiness that filled the space where adrenaline used to live. Her son, Malcolm, picked her up from the airport in Birmingham. He'd grown since she last saw him, his shoulders broader, face thinner, his eyes more like his father's now than hers. He hugged her so hard she almost forgot how exhausted she was. Almost. "Mama," he said against her shoulder, "you came back." She nodded. "I told you I would." But the woman who came back wasn't the same one who left. Her apartment looked smaller, the kitchen less familiar. The world had kept turning in her absence. Her neighbors changed, shops closed down, and the street lights had a strange new glow. She didn't speak of Kandahar, not to Malcolm, not to the nurses at the VA hospital where she took a job, not to the pastor when he asked her to share her testimony at church. And she never spoke of James Hartman. She waited for the letter. For weeks, months, checking the mailbox every day like clockwork. Even after she stopped admitting to herself that she was waiting, she still lingered at the mail slot before walking away. The letter never came. Eventually, she stopped wondering, told herself it was a mistake. Wartime fantasy. Just one more flicker of closeness snuffed out by bureaucracy, distance, or reality. Still, every now and then, especially on nights when the wind sounded like canvas tent walls flapping in the dark, she thought about those pale green eyes, that crooked smile, the way he'd said, "I'll find you again." But he didn't. So she lived. She worked long hours, caring for men and women who bore their own wars in their bodies. She learned how to be useful again, how to put others first in a world that didn't reward it. She never remarried. She had a few offers: a pastor widower, a former officer with a prosthetic leg, a kind maintenance man who brought her sweet tea every Thursday, but she never said yes. None of them were James. She raised Malcolm, watched him graduate, get married, have a daughter of his own. She taught Maya how to plant tulips, how to stand tall when kids asked about her army grandma, and how to find the North Star when you felt lost. She found joy in little things: the scent of hot cornbread, the weight of a new library book, the gospel choirs at Easter service. But there was always something incomplete in her. A quiet space in her chest where a sentence had started but never found its punctuation. Across the country, James Hartman was building a life of his own. After the hospital in Germany, he was transferred to a post in North Carolina, then back home to Abilene, Texas. He married a woman named Claire, a librarian who loved poetry and cats. She knew James had been through something he wouldn't speak of. She didn't push. He loved her for that. They bought a house on the edge of town, lived simply. Claire filled the home with wildflowers and soft music, and James filled the garage with carved wood, ducks mostly. Quiet hobbies for a man with too much memory. He never told Claire about Mabel, not because he forgot, never that, but because the ache had calcified into something sacred. A ghost you didn't speak aloud in case it disappeared. He never stopped wondering what happened to her. He replayed that last handshake 1,000 times. He cursed the soldier who promised to deliver the letter. He wondered if she ever read it, if she threw it away, if she'd forgotten him the second he left. He hoped not. In a shoebox on the top shelf of his closet, tucked between old photos and discharge papers, James kept a folded piece of paper. A copy of the letter. The one he'd written in Afghanistan. Its creases had worn soft from being opened and reread even decades later. Every year on April 16th, the day he'd nearly died, he would sit on his porch, whiskey in hand, and read it aloud to the wind. When Claire passed away in 2014, hit by a distracted driver on her way to Sunday choir, James didn't cry at the funeral. He sat on the front pew with his hands clasped, as if holding something inside him with force. When the service ended and everyone went home, he pulled the letter from the shoebox again. He read it. Then he packed a single suitcase and moved into a veteran's residence in Tennessee to be closer to his brother. The house was too quiet now. The porch too empty. The flower beds too full of weeds. Life slowed. He read, carved, slept more than he used to. He joined a group therapy circle, but rarely spoke. Until one day, a young social worker asked the group to name someone who saved them, someone they never thanked. James cleared his throat. "There was a medic," he said slowly, "in Afghanistan. A woman, black. Her name was Mabel Johnson." The room fell silent. He looked at his hands. "She dragged me out of a wreck, saved my life. I wrote her a letter, but I don't think she ever got it." "Did you ever try to find her?" the counselor asked. James didn't answer. He hadn't. But something shifted after that. He began asking around, quietly, cautiously. Called a few old Army buddies. Searched a veterans database, though the listings were outdated and incomplete. He even searched Facebook once, but the results were too many and too vague. Then, on a Tuesday morning, something changed. He was sitting in the common room at Oak Hill when he overheard a nurse talking to another. "New resident coming in this week. Another vet, female, served in Kandahar. Johnson, I think, black woman, older." James sat up straight. "What did you say her name was?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharper than it had been in years. Johnson. Mabel Johnson, I think. Why? James stood, slowly, shakily, but with purpose. If it's her, he said, tell her. James Hartman's here. He waited. Minutes passed. Then an aide returned, clipboard in hand. She says she'll be right there. James turned toward the hallway, heart pounding. 50 years of silence. 50 years of wondering. 50 years of waiting for the letter to arrive, for the memory to fade, for the feeling to dull. And now, 50 years later, he stood in a sunlit room with a trembling hand and a single name in his mouth. Mabel. The hallway was longer than she remembered. Mabel Johnson walked slowly, her fingers trailing lightly against the wooden handrail that lined the corridor walls of Oak Hill Veterans Residence. Her knees ached slightly with every step, but she ignored them. She had walked through worse: sand, shrapnel, gunfire. This was different. This was a kind of fear she hadn't known since she was young, the kind that pressed against her chest like a hand held too tightly. The soft, institutional lights hummed overhead. Doors stood closed on either side, each labeled with simple brass numbers, each holding lives full of endings, stories pressed between forgotten pages. A few aides bustled quietly by, pushing linen carts or offering pills in plastic cups. Mabel passed them like a shadow, her movements precise, almost ceremonial. She had changed her sweater before leaving her room, chose one in soft navy blue with a high collar. Left the medal behind, not out of shame, but because it didn't feel necessary today. Today was not about war. She reached the corner of the hall where the common lounge opened wide, a sun-drenched room with large windows and worn armchairs that always smelled faintly of dust and weak coffee. The morning light poured in like syrup, golden and thick, casting long shadows across the floor. And then she saw him. He was standing near the far end of the room, facing the garden. Not seated, not hiding. Standing, albeit leaning slightly on a cane, his posture proud despite the years that had clearly worn him down. He had thinned, grown smaller in the shoulders, but the line of his jaw was still strong. His white hair was combed carefully, his shirt tucked in with military neatness. But it was his eyes that struck her. Even from across the room she could see them, pale green. He turned, as if sensing her, and froze. Mabel stood in the doorway, hands clasped gently in front of her. She didn't move. She couldn't. Time collapsed between them. The sand, the silence, the letters never sent. They were no longer old. They were two souls in uniform, caught in the humid heat of a makeshift hospital tent, staring at each other over a cot. "Mabel?" His voice cracked. She stepped forward, not fast, not slow. Her gaze never left his. "You took your time," she said softly, the ghost of a smile on her lips. James let out a breath that seemed to have been trapped inside him for decades. You look." "Don't lie," she said, raising a brow. That broke the tension. He chuckled, the sound half choked with emotion. "You look like someone I've been trying to find for 50 damn years." She stood in front of him now, close enough to see the moisture gathering in his eyes, the tremble in his hand where it gripped the cane. "I thought you forgot me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never did," he replied. "I thought you didn't want to be found." She looked away, just for a moment, then back. "I waited for your letter." "I sent it," he said immediately. "Gave it to a soldier heading back to base." He swore. "I believe you," she interrupted, her voice gentle now. A pause. Then, slowly, without needing to ask, she reached for his hand. Their fingers laced together like it had always been meant to happen. "Walk with me?" he asked. "Always." They stepped out of the lounge and into the garden, side by side. The door closed behind them, muffling the sounds of the home, Outside, the air was cool with the breath of early fall, and the garden was still damp from morning dew. The sycamore tree stretched overhead like an old sentry, its leaves whispering secrets to the breeze. They walked slowly, not out of frailty, but reverence. Every step was a stitch in the seam torn by war and years. Every glance was a rediscovery. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 6 months, he answered. "Moved in after Claire passed." She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." "She was good to me," he said, then paused. "But she didn't know about you." Mabel tilted her head. "You kept me a secret?" "No," he said quietly. "I kept you safe." They reached the bench beneath the tree. Her bench. Without needing to ask, he sat beside her. "I always hoped," he began, then stopped, shook his head. "No, not hoped, believed, that you were out there, still fierce, still standing straight." She smiled, letting her hand rest on the worn wood between them. "I thought maybe I imagined you, that I invented you so I'd have something to miss." They sat in silence for a time, the kind of silence that only comes between people who have nothing left to prove. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you marry?" "I didn't want a half-life," she replied. "Didn't want to wake up next to someone who wasn't you." He looked away quickly, his eyes wet again. "I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner," he said. "You found me now," she said. "That's more than most ever get." Another pause, then he asked, "Do you believe in second chances?" She thought for a moment. "I believe in unfinished stories, and I believe some people are chapters you don't close." "I missed you," he said. "I missed you, too," she whispered. The wind danced through the garden, lifting the corners of the world. She reached out and placed her hand over his, and in that moment, under the weight of memory and the hush of years, two people, once soldiers, now survivors, returned to the center of a story that had never truly ended. They were never flashy. There were no grand confessions beneath fireworks, no sweeping gestures borrowed from movies. Mabel and James, after 50 years apart, settled into something gentler, something more honest. Love, in their season of life, did not arrive like a fire. It moved like water, slow and steady, carving out space where it was needed most. After that first afternoon in the garden, they became a fixture. Staff at Oak Hill began referring to them collectively. The lieutenant and the medic, some said. Others simply called them the two. They took walks every morning, weather permitting. When it rained, they sat by the window near the bookcase, sharing the same chair with a blanket over their knees, watching water bead on the glass like time slipping gently past. James would wait for her outside her room, cane in hand, a crossword tucked under his arm. Mabel, always composed, would emerge with her cardigan neatly buttoned and a knowing smile in her eyes. "You take longer now," she'd say. "I like to make an entrance," he'd reply. They filled their days with quiet rituals, reading aloud from old books. Mabel preferred Langston Hughes and Maya Angelou. James leaned toward Steinbeck and Hemingway. They debated without malice, teased without cruelty. At lunch, they sat side by side, trading bites when one of them forgot to order something. They played dominoes in the evening, Mabel almost always winning. When she lost, she'd claim she was going easy on him because of the leg. He never tired of hearing her laugh. They didn't speak often about the war. It lingered between them like an echo, understood but not intrusive. Now and then it slipped into conversation, a memory of a tent flap caught in the wind, the metallic smell of blood, the moment she cut open his uniform with trembling hands. "You were the last thing I saw before I passed out," he told her once. That's why I thought you were an angel." "I was just scared," she said. "You didn't look it. I was good at pretending." One night, after dinner, they were sitting on their bench beneath the sycamore. The sun had just dipped beyond the trees, the sky streaked with violet and copper. Mabel rested her hand on James's, their fingers relaxed and warm. "I think I stopped believing in love," she said softly. "Somewhere between the deployments and the funerals. I thought I missed my chance." James turned to her. "Maybe we just had to live long enough to deserve it." They didn't get married. It didn't feel necessary. But they made promises in their own way. In early October, one of the younger nurses asked Mabel if they were together. She raised an eyebrow. "You mean, like, dating?" The nurse nodded, flustered. Mabel leaned in, whispering just loud enough to be heard, "Child, we've survived 2 wars, 6 decades, and a lost letter. What do you think?" The nurse laughed, and the story made its way through the halls. In the fall of that year, they held a small gathering under the sycamore. No ceremony, just folding chairs, a few paper cups of sweet tea, and music playing softly from a speaker balanced on a windowsill. They exchanged no vows. They simply looked at each other, eyes full, and nodded. Later, when asked what they'd said to one another during the gathering, James would answer, "We didn't need words, she knew." Their love was not urgent, it was present. In every touch, every shared silence, every look that said, "I'm still here." But time, as always, moved on. Mabel began to grow more tired. Her walk shortened. Her hands, once so sure, began to tremble. James noticed, but she brushed it off. "Just the weather," she'd say, or "old bones. Take your pick." He didn't argue. He simply walked slower. When she was admitted to the facility's medical wing for a respiratory infection, James refused to stay in his room. He brought a chair to her bedside, placed his crossword on the nightstand, and read to her in the evenings. Poems, mostly, the ones she liked. He held her hand as she drifted off to sleep. He never let go. One morning, a nurse entered to find Mabel still, her eyes closed, her hand resting in James's. She looked peaceful, as if she had simply wandered into a dream she didn't want to leave. James didn't speak for a long time after. He returned to his room, quieter now, more hollow. The staff noticed his chair remained empty at meals. The crossword puzzles stayed untouched. He still went to the garden, but only in the late afternoons when the sun hung low and shadows stretched long. 6 months passed. One morning, just before sunrise, a nurse found him on their bench beneath the sycamore. He was sitting upright, a carved wooden bird in his lap. His cane rested against the arm of the bench. In his other hand, loosely held, was a folded piece of paper, a copy of the letter. He had died quietly, not with sadness, but with calm, the kind of peace that comes when the unfinished parts of life have finally been written to the last line. They buried him beside her in a small cemetery on a hillside not far from the home. The headstone was simple, their names etched side by side: Mabel Johnson Medic, Soldier, Angel in Boots, James Hartman Pilot, Fighter, Found and Never Lost. Beneath the names a line carved gently into the stone. Together again, under bullets and stars. And so they were. If this story touched your heart, don't leave without hitting subscribe. We share true, powerful stories like this every week. Stories of love, loss, hope, and second chances. Got someone who needs to hear this? Share this video with them.